And now we cross over to our Oh Soo-young for a global insight and an in-depth look at important developments in world affairs.
Thanks very much, Morgan. It's indeed time for Global Insight. It's been a month since Russia decided to launch an invasion of Ukraine, bombing and storming its cities. But Ukrainians have been fighting back boldly. About 1,300 Ukrainian servicemen have been killed in action, according to their President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. And Nato says around 40,000 Russian soldiers are estimated to have been killed or wounded. As the deaths, casualties and upheaval of cities and lives and livelihoods continue, it's unclear how long this war is going to continue. And we discuss the latest developments today with Michael T. Klare, Senior Visiting Fellow at the Arms Control Association, and Arne Westad, Elihu Professor of History and Global Affairs at Yale University. A very warm welcome to you both. Thank you both so much for joining us. And well, let's begin with you, Dr. Klare. Now, we heard some very worrying news, a worrying statement from US President Joe Biden, who warned that Russia might be preparing to use chemical and biological weapons in Ukraine and use more extreme tactics in general to gain an advantage in the war. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, it's very possible that President Biden has some intelligence that the Russians are thinking of doing something like that, perhaps to try to blame this on the Ukrainians. The Russians have been saying for a while that the CIA has cooperated with the Ukrainians in developing biowarfare labs in Ukraine, and maybe Biden thinks or has intelligence that the Russians are going to try to stage an incident to make the Ukrainians look like they're the people who are doing bad things in Ukraine and distract attention from the crimes that the Russians are doing. I doubt that Russia would use chemical weapons seriously or biological weapons as to achieve victory. They would suffer such terrible international condemnation if they did that.
And what about nuclear weapons, Dr. Klare?
Well, now this is a real worry because President Putin has raised the status of his nuclear weapons capabilities, or at least he's claimed he has done so. It's unclear how far that's gone, but he has made this threat. And there is a worry that if NATO got involved in the conflict by declaring a no-fly zone, and if NATO forces clashed with Russian forces and Russia started to experience really severe defeat in the hands of NATO, in that case, under Russian doctrine, it would be possible that the Russians would use tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield to stave off utter defeat. This is a worry, and I think that's one of the reasons that President Biden has refrained from calling a no-fly zone or any other action that might precipitate a direct clash between U.S. NATO forces and Russian forces.
Well, Professor Westad, now, US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said on Tuesday that the Kremlin had set 3 objectives for itself when it invaded Ukraine, which were subjugating Ukraine, enhancing Moscow's power and prestige, as well as dividing the West. And he said that Russia failed on all 3 objectives. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would very much agree with Jake Sullivan on that. I think Russia set out with rather maximalist goals in mind. They thought that Ukraine will collapse politically and then militarily under the weight of the Russian invasion. And none of that has happened. I also think it's striking that the Russians have been very slow in moving towards the military aims that they have set for themselves. So in purely operational terms, this invasion has been a failure. Also because first and foremost, the Ukrainians' willingness to fight and defend their country. But the civilian losses have been increasing and the fighting is still going on. The Russians are still pushing ahead. So I fear that in spite of these failures, Putin at the moment doesn't seem to be willing to take stock of this and think about a withdrawal. So I'm afraid that the war is going to go on for quite some time.
Professor Westad, well, you said that the Russian invasion of Ukraine looks less like a return to the Cold War, but it in fact appears a bit more similar to World War I. Now, what kind of scenario do you think the world should expect? And, well, for how long do you see this war stretching out?
It could last for a long time. It's really up to the Russians now what they decide to do. I mean, I think that at some point, what is most likely is that Putin will declare victory of some sort, and then try to achieve, at least in limited terms, what he set out to do with regard to Ukraine. But it's not going to be easy because of the mess that the Russians have made of their own operation. Now, in terms of comparison, so the reason why I'm not very happy with the Cold War analogy is that I don't think that in terms of the international system, that this looks very much like the heavily ideologized two-camp division Cold War that we had between the United States and the Soviet Union. But as you indicated in your question, that's not necessarily good news, because to many of us who look at this historically, it looks more like the period before the First World War, late 19th century, early 20th century. Much more of a multipolar international system, much more direct instability, as we've seen. Actual war, not just Cold War. A rise in nationalism, alliance systems that get drawn into conflict. So I'm afraid that at least in the short run, we're in for an even rougher ride than we were at most points during the Cold War, which after all, you know, except in the countries that were really hit by it, such as Korea, had a stability to it. This conflict doesn't seem to have that kind of stability. And as Dr. Klare said earlier on, particularly with regard to weapons of mass destruction, that is really worrying.
And Dr. Klare, well, a senior US official said Tuesday that Russia's combat power has declined to below 90% of pre-invasion levels. But, well, when it comes to, well, basically every quantifiable metric, Russian troops do seem to outnumber Ukraine in terms of military power. So how is it that the Russian army, considered so powerful before the war, has performed so poorly?
You know, it's possible that we all overestimated the power of the Russian army to begin with. I'm used to hearing in Washington when people come before Congress to testify about the Russian military that they always say that the Russian military is so powerful, it has all these weapons. And we may have heard inflated estimates of Russian capabilities. So I would begin there. It turns out the Russian military is not as powerful as we've been led to believe. Secondly, this is a conscript army. These are young men, boys in many cases, with very little training and very low morale, as it turns out. They were not prepared for this conflict. And in many cases, they've performed very poorly. And I think this speaks very bad for the Russian military in the future if they're going to get involved in major conflicts with armed opponents who are as well trained and have as high morale as the Ukrainians do, because this conscript army has performed very badly. And they did also, there's severe problems with the logistical capabilities of the Russian military. They may have deployed very good weapons, but they did not deploy adequate supplies of food and fuel, equipment, clothing, and you can't go into the field on a sustained campaign, as we've seen, without adequate supplies. So add all these things up, and it turns out the Russian military, on a day-to-day ground battle, is not performing very well.
And meanwhile, Professor Westad, now, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, he again called for direct talks with his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin. And, he obviously wants to negotiate an end to the war. But what is it going to take for Mr. Putin to actually bring an end to this war and also save face at the same time?
It's very hard to tell at the moment. I think the least that the Russians need to get out of this, unless the situation for them on the ground, on the battlefield, become entirely catastrophic, is some kind of agreement for a neutralization of Ukraine, which of course the Ukrainians in many ways are willing to give. But also some kind of rearrangement in which there is at least limited Ukrainian recognition of Russian control of the Crimea, and of at least parts of the provinces of Donetsk and Luhansk. So in reality, it is possible, and this will be of some use, I think, to Korean listeners, that what Putin will do is a little bit like what Mao Zedong, the Chinese leader, did during the Korean War, that he will declare victory and then things will more or less go back to status quo before the Korean War started. So I think that is an option, that's a possibility. Putin needs to stabilize his own regime, to save his own regime. So he needs to be able to transmit to his people, to the Russians, a version, even though it will be a false version, that Russia has actually won this war. I think that's the most likely scenario in terms of outcomes at the moment. But as I said, it all depends on what actually happens on the battlefield. That's the thing about war, that you cannot predict beforehand with absolute certainty, given the relative strengths on paper of armies, which direction the war is going to go in. So things could end up a lot worse for Putin than the kind of negotiated scenario that I just outlined.
And Professor Westad, now many are now asking about the future of NATO as well. Estonia has called for NATO to build up a permanent force in Europe following this invasion. And US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, he said also on Tuesday that President Biden will be discussing longer-term adjustments to NATO's force posture and contingencies in the case of nuclear weapons use. And he's expected to discuss that this week. So how do you expect the NATO alliance to change in the aftermath of Russia's invasion?
Well, we have already seen very dramatic changes in NATO, particularly on the European side. I mean, anyone who listened to the proceedings in the German Bundestag, the German parliament, where a social democratic chancellor and a foreign minister from the Green Party laid out what was basically a full rearmament of Germany, confronted with the kind of threat that they now see coming from Russia. That's sensational in NATO terms. So I think what we're going to see is more investment into rebuilding the military force of NATO in Europe. I think we are, as we already seen, what the General Secretary said today, we're going to see more of a permanent stationing, at least for the time being, of allied troops in the eastern parts of NATO. We're probably also going to see much more political cohesion, I think, within NATO with regard to the approaches to Russia. So in many ways, what Putin has achieved here is exactly the opposite of what he set out to achieve. He wanted to put pressure on NATO and see the cracks opening. He thought the West was weak. He thought the United States leadership role was gone. And he has achieved exactly the opposite. I mean, through his own actions, he has driven NATO together in a way that, frankly, few of us, myself among them, thought would be possible, at least in the shorter run. And again, historically, that is sometimes what happens when you wage aggressive war. You frighten everyone else to the point that they coalesce against you. And I think that's perhaps the most important lesson of history that Putin has not taken heed of in this case.
Well, for now, the war continues and nobody knows when it's going to end. But Dr. Klare, it seems that Putin now needs his forces to achieve something that he can sell to his own people as a victory, worth all these huge costs and sacrifices. What do you think the options are right now for the Russian forces?
You know, they're going to try to look for victories somewhere. I'm sure they'll take Mariupol because they've destroyed so much of it that they could just manage to just overcome what remains of the resistance and take that city. When that's done, they will be able to claim a land bridge between the Donbas region, which they already have, and Crimea. So they'll have a whole eastern section of Ukraine that's now united, which before was separated. I think they'll try to take Odessa, which would give them control of the entire coastline. I think, you know, a lot of lives will be lost in the process, and there'll be terrible killings and destruction for them to achieve that. But that might be the point at which Putin says, I've accomplished my goals. I hope the fighting can be stopped before that, but I would imagine that's the kind of victory that Professor Westad was just talking about, that he could claim as a victory.
I'm afraid we're out of time, so we'll have to wrap up the interview here. That was Michael T. Klare, Senior Visiting Fellow at the Arms Control Association, and Arne Westad, Elihu Professor of History and Global Affairs at Yale University. Thank you both so much for your time.
Thank you.